Hello, everybody. So, this is initially being recorded for a specific men's Bible study, a group of guys in Fulton County, Illinois. And so, um, I'm wanting to say hello, everybody, there at Berean Church. I wanted to also know that if you're watching this and some of this stuff doesn't make sense, the context of this is specifically for people in rural America, but I think it applies to a lot of folks. So, with that being said, let's get into things that we don't preach on and why I think this is pretty important for Christians, especially Christian men in rural America. All right, when you look at Scripture, oftentimes it's easy to get lost in a lot of the details. And I bring this up because there's so many books of the Bible. There's 66 books total, 27 New Testament. I mean, we have 4 Gospels. Paul wrote a lot of letters. And whenever we try to think about what Christianity is or what Christianity is not, oftentimes we can get overwhelmed with a lot of information. And something that I've been thinking a lot about is spiritual formation and what it looks like as a Christian man. And as you go through Scripture, different things stand out to you. And I have listed here on the screen the vice list in the Bible. And so ancient philosophers would do something similar to what we see in Scripture here, where they would list off different vices or anti-virtues that you would see in the life of someone. And so typically it would also be done in a context of saying what a virtue is or what something admirable in a citizen should have. And so you can find these elsewhere in different lists, but here specifically we see that Paul in most of his letters has vice lists. And I think it's important to talk about these because I'm going to show on the next slide all the vices listed in Galatians, Romans, 1 Corinthians, and the 1 Timothy list, where when you look at that list, now the important thing is to also then read these vices in context by reading the entirety of the letter. I have had multiple people tell me to do sermons specifically on different things. And so this is where, whenever I bring up the next slide, it'll probably hit people differently. All right, look at all these vices. Now, I color-coded them to have the green ones are Galatians, the red ones are Romans, the black ones are 1 Corinthians, and the blue ones are in the 1 Timothy. And you'll notice that there are repeated vices in different ones, or the bigger thing that I want you to notice is that there's general categories of similar vices. And it's pretty crazy how long the Galatians passage lists them off. And in Galatians specifically, it's talking about the deeds of the flesh, and then in contrast, the fruit of the Spirit, and what the fruit of the Spirit actually is. Now, in philosophical terms, I believe that these are ad hoc, meaning that they're off the cuff. They're not supposed to be extensive, listing every single vice that could exist. The same for the virtue list, that it is, obviously refined and polished, but you'll see typically there's whenever Paul gives his list of virtues, it's in sets of 3 or 5, in contrast to then Galatians where it's 9. But you see these lists, and someone who is steeped deeply inside of a morality or a philosophy is going to be able to have this list that they give off. So I want you to look at this list and think about what angers you whenever you are looking around in the world and you want to say, look at what those people are doing. Certain things will come up. But I want to question, why is it that whenever we ask pastors to preach on things, or Sunday school classes, or we ask philosophers or Bible commentators or Bible teachers to say, what does the Bible talk about a specific thing? You see all these things listed, but some of these are never touched. And So I've been in ministry, so to say, since I was 13 years old. I have done pastoral work since I was done with undergrad. And so that would have been, so I've been in 15 years, I've been in formal ministry inside of preaching, inside of some context, and teaching Sunday schools, doing in depth things. And I tell you what, people have asked me, what does the Bible say about sex? What does the Bible say about alcohol? People have asked me, what does the Bible say about dating and relationships? I've had some questions about, like, does this count as murder or not? But I'll tell you what, I've had some conversations where people have asked about, like, idolatry and witchcraft. But if you look on this list, it's really interesting. We have jealousy listed. We have fits of rage listed. We have envy. We have factions, meaning divisions. We have boastful, arrogant, slanderer, gossip, malice, envy listed again, strife, a good word, insolent in Romans. I know that that's not a word used a lot. And then you have in 1 Corinthians, you again have thieves, greedy, slanderers. And then in 1 Timothy, I'm just going to point out again, we have slave traders and we have perjurers listed there. Now, we have a lot of sexual sins listed, and we have a lot of sins of speech listed. But I want to point out the fact that we don't have people asking preachers to preach on greed and envy a lot. And so I want to ask, when you look at this list, what is it that stands out to you? What is it that stands out to you in your heart? Because that's where Scripture, I think, is wanting to address the matters. But why does this matter? This matters. In Galatians 5, it says that the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. So the vice lists that are there, it's really easy to point out the sins in someone else's life. I cannot tell you how quickly I regrettably judge someone's actions or words or speech. And we are called to discern things biblically. But I think from a spiritual formation standpoint, we need to understand these are red flags. If we see these in our hearts and we see these in our actions, or if we see in our community any of these vices happening. And the reason why is in James chapter 1, it says, "Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in the mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like." God gives us these continual mirrors in Scripture where he's saying, what is your soul? Where are you? How are you? And this is important because God desires for you to look more like Jesus. And he desires for you to teach others how to look more like him. But think about how there's this really sad truth that if all we do is teach morality and it'll help, we'll have a better civilization. But in Scripture, the Pharisees, they were almost perfect keepers of the law. This is something that continually confronts me. Yet they were the people who missed Jesus. And so I think part of the reason, though, why we don't preach on a lot of these virtues or vices, the vices especially, is that the red flags that are the biggest red flags as to whether or not someone can bow the knee to Jesus are the ones that drive the most people away from church. I think it's pretty evident throughout all of history that there is an ethic that, a sexual ethic where we should treat other people's bodies, we should treat our bodies with respect, that there should be a greater thing that we're called to. But yet Christians like to hammer on sexual ethics, I think, a lot more than where it actually hurts our hearts. Because you look at talking about greed, envy, and jealousy, those things, I think, run rampant inside of Christian communities. And I think specifically when we looked at the Pharisees and the Sadducees, that their ability to have power and influence was directly confronted by Jesus Christ and the message of the gospel. We are now going to relook at this vice list as we are thinking about the red flags. And you'll notice that it is color-coded. So with these color-coded, look at the reds. Now, I understand that there's some reds and oranges that are going to look very, very similar, but we have jealousy, selfish ambition, envy, greed, thieves, greedy, swindlers, the slave trade, and perjurers. Those are all items that are very difficult to preach on. Difficult because sometimes they involve aspects of daily life that we miss. But think about how when we advise kids, like what they grow up to be, or whenever we think about a lot of advertising, greed, envy, and jealousy, selfish ambition, those things are so frequent. And then I have underlined things like arrogant and boastful, dissensions, fits of rage, hatred. In our current moment, I think especially how in the small town, it's very easy to feel like everyone is out to get you, that you are dealing with not having all the advantages that the other places have. Businesses are moving out. Employment is not all available, like you're having to commute to different things, not having groceries available. And so it's easy to have this excusing of attitude towards others that's just not okay. And you deal with this in every location. We always find a reason to have anger or rage or dissension, or we try to have this, well, I did this on my own. So the arrogant, the boastful, like the I made myself who I am. And it's on top of that, it's really interesting when you look at the Romans. So look right there in the middle. There's 4 that are right next to each other: deceit, malice, gossip, and slander. All of those are areas where it's interpersonal relationship. And in Romans 1, people like to go to Romans 1 to talk about the evidences of sin, and they try to point to sexual ethics as being the evident area. But think about how these are tied right together. In Romans 1, it has disobedient to parents, boastful and arrogant, deceit, malice, greed, and envy, and murder are all listed together. And so oftentimes as we work through our life, spiritual formation-wise, I think we miss the big red flags in our own life where God is saying, God in Scripture, He gives these big warnings that when these are frequent and evident in our life, we need to watch out. We need to be on guard because these are evidences not of the spirit, but of the flesh. And these warnings are given in Scripture where we're able to ask, are we able to grow and change? So when we see something in the mirror, do we actually own up to it, or are we busy pointing the finger elsewhere? And this is where I think about, the goal of spiritual formation is not to have all the red flags. I have a good friend who's done a lot of motocross, and he talks about how in order to go between 2 trees, you don't look at the tree, you look at the gap. And so if all we're doing is looking for the red flags, that's not the point. But in this, James 1, so we had just read a previous verse in James 1 about the mirror that we look at, but then James 1 says, those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Religion that our God accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after widows and orphans in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. And so we're talking about spiritual formation here, and we're talking about how do we grow more like Jesus? And it's not simply having the correct doctrines. It's not simply having the correct affiliations. It's actually going out and living out our faith in the world. This is the same message that we see in Galatians chapter 5. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but not to use your freedom to indulge in the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. And so the spiritual formation that we have needs to be centered in growth in love. And when we are focused on seeing the vices of other people, and we are quicker to look at the red flags that someone else has, if we're quicker to dismiss the signs of the Spirit that are in someone's life because they're one of us, they're part of our denomination, they're part of our family, they're part of our region, they're part of our political party. If we're able to quickly dismiss their sins because, they're one of us, this is part of the red flags where Scripture calls us to love our neighbor as ourselves and to use our freedom to serve and to be humble. And so when you look at James chapter 1 and Galatians chapter 5, I think about the spiritual formation to grow more like Jesus and to be willing to have the tough conversation with the mirror about who needs to grow. And so my final thought on this is, let us resist the temptation of self-righteously pointing the finger. So you are dealing with this, and it's something that we don't even deal with. Rather, let us hold up the perfect mirror and seek to sanctify where the red flags are flying. And so if you are tempted to always scroll on your phone, but you're not tempted to overeat, it's easy to look at someone who's overeating and say, the Scripture says gluttony is bad, but you're scrolling on your phone all the time. Or if you're constantly having to buy something new or shiny and you're not tempted to look at any of the other vices. So if you're not tempted to do one of those things, but you're tempted to buy something new and shiny all the time, the Scripture says, what mirror are you holding up? And so my encouragement to anyone who watches this, and my challenge to myself, is, am I quicker to see the sins of others and judge them than I am to look at the mirror and ask, am I looking more like Jesus? And so hopefully you've seen that Scripture does speak very clearly about many different issues, vices, and things that shouldn't be debates. But the question that I want to ask is, why do we want to have our pet topics to talk about? Because I think spiritual formation is asking myself and the people I'm close with, why do we want to have our certain issues that we point at, rather than letting Scripture point the mirror at ourselves and say, this is how you need to grow to look more like Jesus? Because I think the reward of looking more like Jesus will be infinitely worth it.